Welcome, everyone. I'm John White. I'm Dean of the Boyd School of Law. Law schools are fundamentally about teaching mechanisms of conflict resolution. It's fitting then that our Saltman Center for Conflict Resolution has been our public face to the general public in different aspects of the possibility of conflict resolution and different techniques for conflict resolution. But within the ambit of the conflict resolution world is the important skill of negotiation, which we teach and we emphasize because it's important for lawyers to know and have. And today's panel brings together one of our key skills that we teach and one of the important games that makes Las Vegas extremely popular, poker. Those two have interesting and important overlaps that we hope to explore, and I'm not going to detain you anymore with that. Today's event is sponsored by the Las Vegas Review-Journal, by the Poker Players Alliance, by Gaming Today, by Lucky's Race and Sports Book, and of course by the Saltman Center for Conflict Resolution. Our moderator today is a relatively young guy, since he and I are the same age, and is the proprietor of Brandywine Gaming, and has a long history in the sporting world. Especially noteworthy is his status as the youngest race announcer in the country some years ago, I imagine. In addition to that, he's an attorney, previously working at the Skadden Arps firm, and a friend of the law school. I bring to the stage Joe Asher.
Hi, everybody. John, thanks for that warm welcome. During this evening, one of the things I'm going to try to do is speak as little as possible, because other than my wife, Cynthia, I don't think anyone else came to see me. And we've got such a great panel of people here, and it's going to be really interesting. These are a phenomenal group of highly intelligent, articulate people who are going to talk about poker and negotiation and the intersection and overlap between the two. So I think they're going to come up on stage here in just a minute, and I'll introduce them to you, and then we'll just get right into it and get started. We have a number of topics to go over, also a couple of videos that were graciously given to us, and I think you're going to find this very, very interesting. Sitting farthest from me is a gentleman named Howard Lederer, who is known as the professor for his analytical style. Howard is one of the most successful and popular professional poker players in the world, with 2 World Series of Poker bracelets, 2 World Poker Tour titles to his credit, and $6 million in career tournament earnings. Howard's first game was chess. He owned his poker skills playing at the Mayfair Club in New York City back in the 1980s. And he's also developed various businesses around his poker skills, and I think you'll really enjoy what he has to say tonight. Sitting next to Howard is his sister, Annie Duke. Annie is one of the most charismatic poker figures in the world. She's a World Series of Poker bracelet winner and recently won the National Heads Up Poker Tournament, earning a $500,000 prize in that one tournament alone. She learned the game from her brother, or so I'm told.
It's true.
She originally intended to become a teacher, but developed her poker game and has gone on to earn more than $4 million in tournament play alone. And as poker fans know, that's just tournament play that doesn't include cash game winnings. She's also an author. She told me earlier her second book will be out in February, a reality TV star with her friend Joan Rivers on The Celebrity Apprentice, and a mother of 4, and we're excited that she's here with us this evening. Jack Binion is probably one of the most well-known figures in the gaming business, and we're very fortunate and appreciative that he took the time to be with us this evening. Jack developed Binion's Horseshoe into a Las Vegas icon after taking over from his father, Benny Binion. Jack hosted the very first World Series of Poker at Binion's in 1970, and that series of tournaments has grown into the most prestigious in the world. The main event will play its final table starting tomorrow. After developing and operating the Horseshoe casinos in Louisiana, Mississippi, Illinois, and Indiana, Jack sold Horseshoe Gaming to Harrah's for over $1 billion. Not only is Jack a tremendous casino operator, but he's also a very skilled poker player, which makes him the perfect person to help illustrate our topics tonight, both from the business and the poker side. And last, but certainly not least, and sitting next to Jack, closest to me, is Russ Koropkin, who's a professor of law and the director of the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution program at the UCLA Law School. He's also taught here at UNLV. Russell is the author of Negotiation Theory and Strategy and more than 50 journal articles on the subjects of negotiation, contracts, and other areas of law, business, and human behavior. He's also a poker player and certainly understands the relationship between these two areas. So please give a nice welcome for our very distinguished panel. Thank you. There are a few thank yous before we get into the substance of the program. There's a fair bit of work that goes into putting something like this on. First and foremost, Mike and Sonia Saltman, who are sitting here this evening and are the Saltmans behind the Saltman Center for Conflict Resolution and tremendous supporters of UNLV Law School. In addition to that, Christine Smith, Elena Bhattacharya, Catherine Bakos, Ray Patterson, Sandra Rodriguez, all of our student ushers who are helping out this evening, Don Castle, Nevada Colwell, who's got the coolest name of the evening, and all the folks here at Cox have done a lot, and my colleague Dan Shapiro has really done a tremendous job in putting together the video and the topics that we're going to be speaking about this evening. And those topics there's 6 topics in total, and we're going to try to get to them. You'll see and hear that there's a lot of overlap between them, as we've all been speaking about. The topics are called Going First, Hand Strength and Leverage, Money Management, Knowing Your Comfort Level, which was Howard's most recent edition, and so we're really looking forward to that one, Emotion, and then the last one is really a topic and a session all to itself, Bluffing, Lying, and Deception. And I suppose really a good way to start off, because we're talking about poker and negotiation, is to discuss and understand the relationship between the two. So I'm going to ask Russell to sort of start and give us his thoughts on that as we get into it.
Thanks, Joe. Well, I think about negotiation as being
Hang on, we need to get your mic fixed, I think.
Mic is not
on. Mine's working. Hello?
Hello?
I think you're there now.
Okay. So negotiation is an interactive communication process where you have 2 or more people who are trying to allocate some kind of scarce.
I think we need to get it
still don't
closer.
think we have it.
Yeah.
Maybe you can move up a little.
Move it
Move it really
yeah.
close to you.
Okay.
Can you hear him now?
Is this no?
No.
Just really get it close.
Really get it close.
Or maybe
Is it me or is it the microphone?
No,
There
so
we go.
that's
There
okay
we go.
now.
There we go. So negotiation is an interactive communication process where 2 or more people are trying to allocate some kind of scarce resource. And by that definition, poker definitely fits into the definition of negotiation. So one way to think about this panel is that poker is an example of negotiation, but it's of course a particular type of negotiation, right? It's highly structured, and it's different from more usual negotiation situations in some important ways. So the way I like to think about the exact comparison is that in poker, let's say there are 2 people that are playing a hand, and they're trying to convince each other to concede the pot. So they're engaged in a process of betting, raising, and re-raising along different different rounds of the hand in order to try to agree who's going to get the pot. If they fail to reach an agreement, because in negotiation you usually have the possibility of reaching an agreement and the possibility of an impasse. If the poker players fail to reach an agreement in their betting behavior as to who is going to capture the pot, Then they reach an impasse and they pursue their alternative. And in the case of poker, the alternative that both players have is the same alternative. That is, they agree to go to a showdown where the pot is allocated according to a particular procedure. That is, according to who has the best 5-card poker hand. So I like to think of poker as a particular kind of negotiation. But there are a couple of important differences, right? One important difference from a typical negotiation and a poker negotiation is that in a typical negotiation, whatever the cooperative surplus is, whatever the value that's at stake, can be divided between the negotiators. In poker, it's all or nothing, right? One player gets the whole, setting aside the rare case of having exactly the same hand, one player wins the entire pot. You can't agree to divide the pot in a particular way like you can in a standard negotiation. And the other odd thing about poker from a negotiation point of view is that the value that you're trying to divide is being created over the course of the negotiation by the players putting chips or money into the pot. In the more general negotiation situation, the value is there before the negotiators come together to negotiate. And then they're trying to allocate that value at that time. So because of the similarities and the differences between poker and the typical negotiation, I think there are a lot of things we can learn about negotiation generally by understanding poker. And at the same time, and we'll talk about this over the course of the evening, there are some, because of the peculiarities or idiosyncrasies about poker as a form of negotiation, there are some lessons of poker that negotiators might not want to learn, right, or might be detrimental to one's success generally in negotiation. And I think we'll try to talk about both sides of that comparison.
The first topic was actually the last topic, but then we realized it didn't make much sense to be last because it's called Going First. So we figured it was a much better place to start it at the beginning. And it's such a fascinating topic. We're going to come back to it at the end because Annie was really educating me on one particular hand that we're going to show you and how that wraps into what we're talking about. And it's typical in negotiation, right? Who goes first, who doesn't go first. Jack, I think you've got a pretty interesting perspective on this from your distinguished business career that really highlights the issue.
Well, actually, you should let Annie and Howard tell you the strength of going last. And then I got a good illustration, but I'll tell you what the illustration is. In Tunica County, Mississippi, there was a large old family that had some farmland that was now going to become casino land, and they had had this land since 1836. So this is a wide-ranging family. And I found this out later. They all got together and they said, listen, let's ask $5 million for this property. And the others said, oh man, that's just, you're just going to turn him off. They just won't go for that. Well, we'll try it, okay. So they go in, and fortunately for them, the casino company started first. And the casino company says, listen, we've thought this over, and our bottom line is $20 million. Well, so probably the one guy that could get his breath said, let us get off and talk about it. And so make a long story short, they sold it for $25 million. And I think that's an illustration of being able to go last is maybe better most of the time. Now there is points of going first, but that's a good illustration.
Yeah, Annie or Howard, do you want to sort of jump?
Certainly, poker, I mean, in my opinion, poker is the world's greatest game. It was actually the game that was used to invent game theory. John von Neumann, back, I believe it was in the 30s, used a simplified, he actually had to simplify the game of poker to invent just one of the great areas of mathematics. It spawned many Nobel Prizes, actually. And when he was asked many years later about why did you use poker to invent this great area of mathematics? Why didn't you use chess? And he actually said, well, I couldn't use chess. Chess isn't a game. And I actually agree with him in terms of what he meant. It's not a game in a game theory sense. It's a game that has perfect information. And of course, in life and in negotiation, we want to have perfect information before we make any type of decision, but we don't. So I think what you get when you play poker is this is this game. You get to play this game, you get this sort of playing field where you get to practice making difficult pressure decisions under conditions of uncertainty. We don't know exactly what our opponent has, and maybe more important than knowing what our opponent has, we don't know the strategy that our opponent is using. Even if you know what your opponent has, you have to know what they're going to do with what they have if you're going to make sort of the perfect poker decision. And really, because of that, because you can't know what your opponent has, you can only have a good idea, and you can never know what their strategy is, there are no perfect poker plays. And because of that, going first is a real problem. Because if you have to go first in a round of betting, that's just that much less information that you have. It's kind of a double. You have to act before you know anything about certainly your opponent's strategy, and that's going to hurt your chances of figuring out your opponent's cards. If you think about it, when you go second, your opponent not only has, through their action, given you some sense of just at least the simple, are they strong or are they weak? But you have some idea of your opponent's strategy. They've already used one of their options to execute their strategy before you had to, and it's just a tremendous advantage, and you have to be aware of it. But the good news is you know what your position will be before you really enter the hand. So you get choices. You get to actually choose the hands where you're going to get to act second. You play those hands more often than when you're going to have to act first.
So one of the great lessons that I think that we can learn from poker in terms of this informational issue is that the first thing is that if we understand that this is a game, that poker is a game where you're making decisions with incomplete information, where we're under conditions of uncertainty, which is the same thing you do with a negotiation. You don't necessarily know your opponent's position or what their bottom line is or what cards they're holding. Then we should set our number one goal to be able to act in a situation where we have more certainty rather. We know that when we get to go second, we're always going to be in a position of more certainty. But the way that we can counteract this problem when we're going first is to make sure that we have certainty at least about our hand. So one of the things that I try to tell people, and this is true in regular negotiation as well, is that if you're going to go first, you have to have a lot of information in advance. So you either have to have done quite a bit of research about your opposing party in the negotiation, or in the case of poker, you can choose to play hands that have a lot of clarity in and of themselves. So if you get involved with a hand like, say, a 7 of hearts and a 6 of hearts, this hand is a hand that doesn't have a lot of clarity. Even if you were to make one of the better hands that you could make, which would be a flush, you still don't have what's called the very best hand, right? Because there's lots of flushes that are better than your hand, and you're kind of in this situation of uncertainty, so you'd prefer to have that when the other person will go first. But if you enter the pot first and you have a hand like aces, now you just don't need to know as much about what your opponent is holding because your hand contains clarity in and of itself. So when you're choosing to go first, you should be in a clear position for yourself, and that's true outside of the poker table. So one of the things that I try to tell players is don't get your ego involved, because a lot of people think, well, I'm such a good player, I can play from any position. And what I try to tell them is at least please be as smart as my children are. So I have 2 very young girls. And I say I like to set very low bars, so could you please be at least as smart as my 7-year-old? Now my youngest is now 8, but when she was 7, I actually witnessed an argument happen, which is my 7-year-old said to another 7-year-old friend, her friend said to her, do you like Hannah Montana? And my daughter said, I don't know, do you? And how many of you have children who have seen this argument take place? So then the other girl said, I asked you first. And there was a little argument that happened, and they came running to me, and I sort of was supposed to arbitrate about who had to make the first offer in this negotiation about Hannah Montana. So what happened was that what my 7-year-old understood was that there was a lot of social equity in the answer, right? So if the other girl did like Hannah Montana and she said no, that was a problem. If the other girl didn't like Hannah Montana and she said yes, it was a problem. So 50% of the time she was going to answer poorly. So I said, if my 7-year-old understands this, you probably should too. And what my 7-year-old also would have understood was that if she happened to see that the girl was wearing a Hannah Montana t-shirt at the time, so she had a lot of clarity about the situation, she could have easily said, I like Hannah Montana. So we sort of see this across every aspect when we pull it away from the poker table. So that's what I'm telling, just be smarter than my small child, who I think is brilliant, but she's still 7.
Yeah, also there's a point in terms of the going first, and that is in poker you can affect that situation. So there are very often situations where there's very reasonable play where you can either decide to sort of extend the hand, maybe just call with a pretty good hand, maybe you're going to induce a bluff. There are lots of reasons to sort of play a little more passively, but you also are now creating more decision points in the hand by doing that. And sometimes with that same type of hand, maybe a very reasonable decision would be to move all in and put the decision on your opponent. When you are out of position, you should be much more willing to move toward the move all in variation as long as it's a reasonable variation. Once all your chips are in the middle of the pot, you don't have to make any more decisions. So you don't have to go first anymore. Your opponent's going to have to make the last decision of the hand, which is in advantage of itself. But now there are no more rounds of betting. There are no more decisions where you have to go first. And certainly when you go second in a poker hand, and again you're presented with that, okay, maybe I should just call, maybe I should raise and move all in, you should tend toward the calling because you will have that much more information the next time you have to make the decision on the next round.
It just creates optionality for yourself. That one of the things that we need to do in poker is we need to decide, at the point that I make my decision, I have to decide about what my decision might look like on the next card, and then what my decision might look like on the next card after that. The big advantage to being in position is that you don't have to decide right now. You can say, well, you know what, I'm just going to call, and then I'm going to see what my opponent does. And then depending on what my opponent does, then I have a variety of options that I can do in response. When you're out of position, the minute that you choose to make the call, you have to have already decided what your next street is going to be. And that just puts a lot more pressure on your decisions. And one thing that I really like to point out to people is that this is a problem whether you have the best hand or whether you're bluffing. Because when we have a bluff, it's harder to execute out of position because it's easier to bluff when someone is playing into you because you get a lot more feel for if they're weak. You get a lot less expensive opportunities to bluff. So when you're in position, you can often bluff for just a bet. When you're out of position, you're generally having to bluff for a raise, which is exponentially greater. It's not just twice as much because you're actually raising the size of the pot. So it's very often 3 to 4 times as much money. So you have to have a higher percentage of times that you're correct in the decision to bluff in order to be profitable. People have a really easy time understanding that problem, but the opposite problem is a little harder for them, which is that when you have the best hand, it's very often the case that it's more difficult to cash the best hand. And I think that Jack's story speaks so beautifully to this, with the casino having come in first. If you have the best hand, it's much easier to extract the appropriate amount of money from your opponent when they have to come in first. The casino cost themselves $20 million by having to go first, and they clearly had the best hand. This was a family that wanted to sell, they were willing to sell cheap, and the casino was the one with the money to buy. But because they had to go first, they didn't cash that situation properly. Had they been able to go second, they would have been able to extract much more value out of that negotiation than they actually did. And that's true if you flopped a set of aces. If you have the very best hand, it's easier to get money when people can make mistakes into you, as opposed to when you're first, when you have to induce them to make mistakes, and that's just much harder to execute.
So let me try to generalize these points and then add a couple more of my own. So in negotiation, like in poker, the advantage to going second, right, or letting someone else go first, is that, as Jack's story and as Howard and Annie's analysis has demonstrated, you have more information available when you go second, right? When you go first, you have to put something out there without having as much information about what the other person is holding. And in negotiation, I would think about the comparison to the cards that a player's holding in poker as being, what's the other person's reservation price? That is the most they'll pay or the minimum that they'll accept if we're talking about a simple sale of an asset. So if I'm the buyers, or if I'm the sellers of land for the casino, by waiting and not going first, I let the casino reveal information about its reservation price that I didn't have. If I, as the landowners, went first, not having that information, in this case, I probably would have made an offer that was way too low, right? And I would have left money on the table. You can also have the reverse problem. If you make a demand or an offer that's way too high because you don't have very good information about the other party's reservation price, you can make them angry, right? They can think that you're not negotiating in good faith or that you're violating social norms in some way. So the casino, the landowners would have been very hesitant to come in and ask for $50 million for the land because they'd be afraid of offending the casino. So by going second, you get more information, you help make these problems less likely to occur. But in negotiation theory, there are a couple points on the other side, too. There are a couple reasons why going first can be an advantage. One is you can set the other side's expectation about your reservation price a little bit more easily by going first. So, for example, if I'm the casino in Jack's case, and I don't know, I know that the landowners don't have a very good idea of what my reservation price is. If I went first and made a very, very low offer, then that might have convinced the landowners that my reservation price was actually very low instead of being maybe higher, maybe what they would have thought if they didn't have any information. So by going first, I can affect the other party's view of my reservation price. I also have the possibility to affect their reservation price by doing what psychologists call setting an anchor. So if I go in and I offer for the land, I say, we wouldn't be willing to pay more than $1 million for your property. We've done our analysis. Psychologists have demonstrated that by putting that number $1,000 out there, then the person on the other side of the negotiation will have more mental access to facts and information that would suggest $1,000 might be a reasonable price for them to accept. So if the landowners they're not really sure about their reservation price. They'd like to get $5 million, but they don't really know what a fair price would be. So if I go in with the $1 million offer, then they will start accessing arguments and facts that would suggest $1,000 is a fair price. So on one hand, if I go first, I'm at an information disadvantage. But I've got a couple of advantages to counteract that. So usually...
Russell, we get one poker hand that I think really illustrates this point.
Okay.
In fact, Dan, if you can cue up the videotape so we can go to that now. This is a hand involving Doyle Brunson, and after the hand, I think Howard or Annie can speak to the challenge that that Doyle's opponent faced in this very hand.
Will Davis will be second to act this hand. Williams folds.
Been there and
Pocket sixes for the loose cannon. Raises to 1,200. Action folds around to Doyle Brunson. With the Brunson.
And he's reaching for chips.
Raise the pot.
I guess if the hand's named after you, that does make you pot committed.
A raise to 4,400.
So 32 more? Yes, correct.
Will calls.
I don't know if anyone's the real favorite against 10 deuce when Doyle's holding it.
8 queen deuce on the flop. Bottom pair for Doyle.
What you got, approximately?
Oh, now you sound like an internet player.
No, not just approximate. That's good. I can
50,
see.
55, 60.
I'm all in.
Doyle's all in.
Wow.
Fire up the TiVo. It's the Doyle show.
Doyle Brunson poker, baby.
Will folds.
You said it.
Doyle shows the Brunson.
Oh, no. You just can't help it with that hand. Doyle just can't help it. This is Doyle's hand right here.
Howard, what do you think?
Well, I mean, there are situations, and particularly when you're bluffing, where going first is a good thing. If he had gone second and was facing a bet, he might have had a much harder time bluffing at that hand. I mean, he certainly set it up by re-raising, before the flop. But I mean, certainly, I think maybe the number one proponent of actually going first is Gus Hansen, who's certainly known as a big bluffer. He really likes the chance, actually, sometimes, when he's kind of a little out there, being able to act first. He actually feels like people have a hard time. It is so common for people to check after the flop, out of position, that you kind of get them a little confused when you lead out. Now, I mean, it turned out in that particular hand, his opponent didn't flop a big hand. and he probably would have won that hand if he was in position or out of position. But certainly, when you're in a bluffing situation, you know, sometimes your bluff can be taken away. There are certainly a number of pots. It's rarer than just the typical situation where being in position helps you. But there are plenty of pots that have been won or lost by the fact that the person got to the bluff first. Where if Doyle was in position and the other player decided to bluff, he would have been in big trouble there.
So I have a kind of interesting take on that hand, which is I think it demonstrates why it's very difficult to go first, even though it happened to be successful for him. Let me explain why, and it speaks back to something that Howard said. What you just saw there at the point that he chose to bluff the hand wasn't actually a negotiation, because there was no response that the other person could give. That was beyond, he was forced to put all of his chips in the pot in order to execute that bluff, because what he realized is that if I bet out and I allow the person to have a response, he realized that the other player was weak as well, by the way, which was important. But so he did what was called taking the lead before the flop. So he paid an expensive price to have the right to bet first. That's what that means, because if you notice that Doyle re-raised before the flop. Had he been in position, he would have been able to just open raise, so that would have been a less expensive play. Once the flop came down, what Doyle realized is that if I bet in a way that allows the other person to have any actual response to this, right, other than just calling, I'm going to be in big trouble. So he was forced to actually do something that we would consider a little bit aggro, which is get all of his chips into the pot. Realizing that once I get all my chips into the pot, there is no response for him. There's no more decisions for me because now I'm out of position. And I don't want to have to go first on the next round because this is kind of a crappy position for me to be in with a hand that sort of caught the board, but I don't really know whether it's good or not.
And his opponent had the kind of hand
right.
where if Doyle had been willing to extend the hand and make a normal size bet there after the flop, his opponent very well might have said, well, I don't have much here, but if Doyle doesn't have much, I'm going to have a lot more information by the time I have to act again here. Maybe I'll just call and see what he does next round. But he took all the play away.
Right.
He decided this was a good bluffing situation.
And he was forced to lay a very big price. Now that was going to put a lot more mathematical pressure on Doyle. Had he been able to execute that same bluff in position, it could have gone something like he has the lead, the other guy checks to him, Doyle bets, the other guy would probably call, which against that type of player would let Doyle know he's probably weak. And then the other guy would probably check the turn, Doyle would make another small bet at the pot, and the other person would fold. And it would have cost Doyle, just sort of looking at the chip stacks, probably about a third as much money to execute the same play. So we don't want to result and say, oh, look how well being out of position worked for him. What we should do is say, oh, look how much he had to pay in order to execute that hand compared to what he would have been able to do to execute that same bluff in position. And I think that that's what we want to take away from that. On the anchoring note, there is one place where you can, in a sense, anchor hands in poker, which is when you get to the river of a hand. So remember now, there's no more cards. There's kind of no more negotiation going on here. And you have a hand where you're very unsure about what the status of your hand is. You know that it may very well be good, so that if you were to check and the other person were to bet, you would call. But you don't know if it's the best hand, so you can't really stand to face a big, huge bet. You might do what's called a blocking bet or a defensive bet, which is to anchor the bet very low, to make an extra small bet, knowing that that might be read for sort of strength from your opponent. It's difficult for them to raise you unless they really have a big hand, and now you get out of the hand cheaper and you force them to call an amount that's smaller. But speaking to what you said, there's a reputational issue that gets involved with that, which is that if somebody spots that pattern over the course of the long run, they're actually going to take advantage of that. So I would say that in the anchoring as well, that if you go in and you anchor a negotiation low, you better be prepared to stay low. Because if you go in and you anchor it at $1 million and you're willing to play 20 million, that reputation will get out, and the next time you try to go anchor low, people are just going to be like, well, I'm going to offer back 20 million and the anchor is going to work well.
I have another story.
Oh, good.
Years ago, it got down in the World Series of Poker, there was 3 people left. Tom McEvoy, Rod Peet, and Doyle. And Doyle had the most money. And this goes back to managing expectations and setting the tempo of the game. Board comes 9, rag, kind of a, you know, not a dangerous looking hand. Doyle moved in on him. Unfortunately, one of them, I can't remember, I think it was Rod Peet, had 2 9s in the hole. So Doyle just ran right into, and now, what was Doyle trying to do? The odds were this was going to work, but what he was doing, he was intimidating these guys for the start, for down the road, that every time he wanted them to know that every time they get in that pot, every time they put in $1, Doyle's going to be like a lion and take it away from them. And in fact, he was intimidating them. And he just happened to run into the hand that killed him, and that's why Doyle did not win that year. Tom McAvoy did.
That's the problem with going first, is that he had to lay such a big price in order to execute that intimidation.
Well, the big thing is this. He was setting the tempo, and sometimes, look, going first, sometimes you have to, there's protocol. Like in a labor negotiation, the labor always comes in effect, goes first. The other thing is that you are managing expectations, and you're kind of setting the tempo of what you want to do. Now, do you have your choice when you go second? Yes. But sometimes there is something to be said for going first.
Well, and you want to make sure if you are going first, you need to have very good information, right? You want to go first in a situation when you're negotiating where you have a pretty good idea of the other party's reservation price. You might not know it exactly, but you've got a fair bit of information. So if you're in a situation where you know nothing about the other party's reservation price, you almost always don't want to make the first offer. But when you have some information and you can narrow it down a little bit, then the advantages that can come from going first can outweigh the disadvantages.
Well, and this leads actually into the next topic, which we should go right into, hand strength and leverage. And obviously there's a lot to talk about here, but Russ, you have an anecdote that I think illustrates it first to start off, involving a labor negotiation, as Jack alluded to.
Well, so I think the point I wanted to make about leverage, Joe, is that I think similarity between poker and negotiation, which is always important to remember, is that the context matters more than anything as to who has leverage in a particular hand of poker or in a particular negotiation. That over time, playing against Jack or Annie or Howard, I'm going to get wiped out in poker. But in any one hand, if I have a pair of aces, right, I'm a heavy favorite in that hand. And so you can't assume in either poker or negotiation that, that facts that are fixed are going to determine who has leverage in the particular case. And the story that Joe wanted me to tell, or the anecdote, is that if a big casino here in town is having a negotiation with an organization of its maids, right, over what the hourly rate is going to be, who has the most leverage in that negotiation? And the answer, I think, is it depends. Right? It depends. And in negotiation, the main source of leverage is what your outside alternative is, what you're going to do if you don't reach an agreement in this case. So if unemployment is high and there are lots of people that want jobs as maids, then the casino is going to have a lot of leverage. If unemployment is low and the casino is having trouble getting enough maids, then the maids are going to have, relatively speaking, a lot of leverage in that negotiation. And so you have to consider context before you make assumptions about who's got the leverage in a particular situation.
Annie, did you have a thought on in context and leverage being contextual that you wanted to share?
So I think that one of the places where you see this the most is in how the board lays, in terms of what the explosion of possibilities for what the other person's hand might look like given the next card. So you can have a hand like, say, the 2 9s that we talked about before, where a 9 lands on the board, where the board is something like ace of spades, 9 of diamonds, 3 of hearts. Now this is a hand where it's very easy to define the set of possibilities for what the other person is holding. They could have 3 aces, which is the only hand that beats you, and then they could have 3 3s, some sort of ace in their hand, an ace and a 9, an ace and a 3, but it's a very narrow set of possibilities for what the other person might have. And the next card is unlikely to change that set of possibilities very much. There's just not a lot that can happen to the board that's very interesting. But if you have the same set of 9s, and the board is now 10 of spades, 9 of spades, 4 of hearts now, with that 10-9 of spades, where those cards are extremely related to each other, now you have a situation where often fully half the deck can actually very much change the possibilities for what the other person might be holding. So while the best hand they could have right now is 3 10s, that's the only hand that can beat you, and all the others you beat, if any spade comes out, they could now have a flush. If the straight cards come out, they could now have made a straight. if a 10 hits, they could now make a better full house than you have, and there's quite a bit of troublesome things that can happen to that board, and it actually changes the way you play. If you were to flop a set of 9s in the case where the board is not dangerous, for example, you would play in a way where you would want to extend the hand in some way, or you would want to cause the other person to make a very bad move against you. So if you were heads up when someone bet into you, would have a tendency just to call there and allow the hand to extend to give them opportunities to give you more money. If you were out of position, you probably wouldn't ever be going for a check raise. In fact, if you were against a particularly aggressive opponent, you would bet out to induce them to raise you, or at least to just call you trying to bluff you, which is what a lot of very good players do against the right kind of opponent. But you're really looking for extension here. In the second case, however, if someone were to bet into you, you would raise in order to disconnect the decision process on the next card, because you realize that this might be a very troublesome card for you. And if you were out of position now, you would have a tendency to really want to check raise that hand and just get that hand done with right then, which shows you that you have a hand that looks exactly the same, but because of contextual issues, your leverage is very different on that hand.
Well, and there's a very underrated issue. It's a mistake to just think about that decision on the 10-9-4 board where there are 2 spades just in terms of what are the chances that my opponent beats me.
Right.
But it's also very important to understand that if your opponent has a strong hand that you have beat, let's say that your opponent has a pair of queens there, you want to get the chips in the middle of the pot quickly, because when the 7 of spades hits, all of a sudden the player with the 2 queens can come up with a lot of reasons why, wow, maybe I'm beat, and they might fold. So slow playing those dangerous flops can cost you the pot, but also can cost you a very big pot against a strong hand that you have beat, because all of a sudden the scare card comes on the turn and they slow way down.
And just on the flip side of that, it can also give your opponent opportunities to bluff you off the best hand. And the problem for you is you might be the best reader of your opponent and not know that they aren't strong, because they might not know they're bluffing. So if they have a hand like 2 aces, for example, with the ace of spades, if you get all the money in on the flop, clearly those aces aren't going to fold. You're going to get a lot of money from them. It's going to be very good for you. But if you allow, say, the deuce of spades to come off on the turn, now that person might move in very confidently, knowing, well, I have 2 aces, plus I have the ace of spades, so they can't have the nut flush, and even if I'm wrong, they could make a spade. And now you've got someone who's sitting there extremely confidently. You're looking at them, oh, that's a really confident move in. You throw your 3 9s in the muck, and you just made a pot mistake. So it's not just that you might kill action from a really good hand that might have given you money on the flop, but it's that you might get bluffed off by a hand that doesn't even know they're bluffing. I mean, it's a horrible situation when you get these contextual problems, and so you just want to make that move right away, which reduces your strength in the hand because you have to show your hand earlier, basically, so you can't be as cagey about it.
Right, and you certainly don't want to overplay. I mean, talking sort of further on this topic, you know, you want to use leverage. You don't want to overplay your hand. In general, when you're playing, let's say, no limit hold'em, you are betting around the size of the pot, maybe 2/3 of the size of the pot. And you're doing that because you, very often when you're bluffing or you have a strong hand, now you get to test your bluffs without committing a huge portion of your chips. And the reason a bluff where you're not betting a lot can work is because there may be more rounds to go. So your opponent is sitting there, let's say the board is ace 9-3, and your opponent has a pair of jacks. You know, there's a pretty good chance that your jacks are good there when you're facing a small bet. But the problem is the board is unlikely to change, and there are 2 more rounds of betting. You aren't just calling that small bet. Let's say there's 200 in the pot and your opponent's just bet 125. Not that hard, but it's not the 125 you're looking at. You're looking at 125 on that call, and on the next street it's going to be 250, and on the last street it's going to be 500. You add that up. Now that's real leverage, but it also gives you the opportunity to test your bluffs. Instead of just pushing all your chips in, you're kind of making this 125 bluff, and you're threatening your opponent with further bluffs, but you don't necessarily, if, again, a game of imperfect information where you're trying to figure out your opponent's strategy, what a wonderful way. You test the waters with sort of a leveraged bluff, and once your opponent has shown you a willingness to call, maybe you pull back and you save the rest of the bluff for another hand.
The next topic we have is one that this touches on, and there is a lot of overlap in all of this, is money management. And I know, Annie, you were very passionate about this earlier, and the importance of managing your money properly, having limits in advance, and perhaps you could speak a little bit about that, and then there's an obvious correlate from the business perspective as well that we'll talk about.
Sure. I mean, one of the things that Jack and Howard and I are very intimate with in terms of this concept is that we've seen many people come through poker who were really good poker players who have gone broke, and you never see them again. And the reason why they go broke is because they're not good money managers. Because the fact is that if you have no money to churn, you can't earn. It's just as simple as that you have some sort of edge on the game. An excellent poker player, it's going to be somewhere around 5% if they're really good. And if you're churning your money through at a 5% earn rate, you're going to make all the money in the world as long as you have money to churn. And if you aren't managing your money well, okay, so you're not. So basically the problem is that we understand that when you make decisions, that poker is a game of very rational decision making, and when you're feeling very emotional, you can't make rational decisions. And there's a psychophysiological reason for that, which is that the area of the brain that's responsible for rational thinking, which is the front part of your brain, the frontal lobe, cannot turn on at the same time as the area of your brain which is responsible for emotions, which is the limbic system. So when the limbic system is lit up, the frontal lobe shuts down. When the frontal lobe is lit up, the limbic system shuts down. So these two things can't light up at the same time. So one of the things that I always recommend to people is that given that you know that negotiations can be extremely emotional, particularly things like labor negotiations, which can get very emotional, where people start bringing in ideas of respect, so on and so forth into it. So they're personalizing what's going on in the negotiation. The emotion can start to run very high. And when emotion runs very high, decisions won't be very good. So I always tell people that you should liken this to drunk driving. That we know that if we're drunk, we're going to make a very poor decision about whether we're in a state where we can drive. So there are things that you can do in order to avert that, which is mainly to make your decisions in advance of ever having a drink. Either give your keys to somebody or set a designated driver, because what you recognize is that I'm of right mind now, and I'm thinking rationally now, so I better make my decisions now, because later I won't actually be of right mind. And we should do this at the poker table, and we do it in terms of two things. One is time limits on our play, and one is loss limits on our play. So loss limits are basically saying that when I go into a game, I'm only going to risk a certain percentage of my bankroll in the game, and that percentage should be what your edge is in general. So if you have a 5% edge on the game that you're playing, you would risk 5% of your bankroll, and that's it. I'm not going to go any further, because right now I'm thinking rationally. But I know that when I'm losing, there's going to be a couple things that are going to be really bad. The first is that I'm going to be a very poor judge of why I'm losing. I'm going to tend to attribute it to luck, because when we're losing, we tend to socialize our results, and I'm going to say, oh, these people are really bad, and I've just been unlucky, when that might not be the case. But also, you know that other players are going to be treating you in a way that they're going to be putting a lot of big decisions on you, because they're just not going to believe you when you're bet, and they're going to think you're unlucky, and so it's what's called your table image. It's eroded, so they're going to tend to be more aggressive against you.
Also, they're winning.
Right.
In general, your
So they're
chips
playing
are
better.
in their stack.
So they're playing better because they're unemotional.
Because they're happy and they're
happy. So what I say is that if you go in knowing that I can only lose this amount, and that's what you've set rationally, then you can stop yourself from continuing in the game when you're not thinking rationally, you're not playing well, and the other players are going to be playing better than you and coming after you. The other thing to recognize is that you should set time limits to a negotiation whenever you can, because when you're tired, you also aren't thinking rationally. So in poker, if you're playing online and you're sitting in front of an LED screen, my recommendations is no more than 6 hours, because that's very tiring. In live poker, it would depend on you as an individual, but between 6 and 8 hours. That stops you from playing when you're tired, and it stops you from playing when you've been playing a long time, and fresh people get to come in who've just woken up and are raring to go, get to come in and play on you.
Also, I think that players tend to... you can be a very consistent winning player, and over the course of many, many hundreds of hours that you may play every year, you may win quite a bit. And you kind of see that result. Wow, I've won a lot of money as a poker player over the years. But that winning comes from very small edges. And players tend to overestimate how much better they are than their opponents. Yes, you have tremendous evidence that you are better. You are a winning poker player, but your edge each day, each decision is very small. So being a little tired, or or being at your loss limit, that can wipe out your edge altogether. And I think people they definitely overestimate their edge, so they underestimate how much, it's very easy to now get to the point where you don't have the best of it.
Right.
Because you're a little tired, and I'm just a little tired, I still have an edge, I can beat these players. Yeah, you can beat them when you're fresh and you're not losing a lot.
Well, and I think one of the reasons why players overestimate their edge actually is that if you buy into a game for $1,000 and your average win for the night is, let's say, $200, now all of a sudden you're like, wow, I'm 20% better than the game. But what you don't realize is that you didn't win $200 on 1,000. You might have churned 10,000 through that game, which would be more likely, and then your edge is actually 2%, which, by the way, for an average winning player is going to be about what their edge is. And so they're looking at that saying, wow, I'm so much better than the game, I earned 20% on my money, because they don't understand they didn't earn 20% on 1,000, they earned 20% on 10,000. And so it makes it very difficult for you to make good decisions. So recognizing a small edge and then setting loss limits and avoiding emotional decision making is going to allow you to be playing at your edge, as opposed to that edge can slip away super fast.
Jack, talk about, if you would, for a minute, in the negotiation from the business side, resources and the finite nature of resources that you have to deal with in money management. So resources in negotiation are typically finite. What role does that play in your negotiating your deals?
Well, naturally, it does play a big part. And let me say this too, just some advice about money management. In poker, you have to play the hand by yourself. You have to make all the decisions by yourself. In negotiations, you might be the world's greatest negotiator on buying cars and selling cars. But there's something out there that you're negotiating on you don't know diddly about. And same way with poker players. A lot of poker players, they play, let's say, Hold'em or something real good. They can't play high-low split at all. And we could tell you a good story about that. But one of the things that you can do, and that's go get a good advice and go get somebody to help you. It's kind of like, when you're in school, you're going to have to fight Joy, and God, don't know. Well, you go get RD. He's the toughest kid around, and he gives you a lot of comfort, and you can money manage. I think it's important to get people that can help you.
Go ahead, Russell.
Yeah, so let me just approach this broad topic from a slightly different angle, because I think there's a great point here from poker for negotiators. And that is sort of the first question about money management that you have to deal with in poker, and it's the beginning of every poker book, anyone that's ever read a book on poker. It's the question of whether to put your money in a hand or not, right? Whether to enter the hand and put money at risk, or whether to sit the hand out. And poker players who are good poker players, they make a very careful cost-benefit analysis, right? They only want to put money in the pot if it has a positive expected value. Of course, they're not going to win every time, but they want to have, on average, over the long run, they want to have a positive expected value. My sense is most negotiators don't think about the decision about whether to get involved in a negotiation in the same careful way, and they should. Most negotiators generally assume there's no harm in negotiating. I can always walk away without a deal. I'm not losing my chips like I am in poker if I put my money in the pot. But in fact, that's not really true. There are several ways that by getting involved in the negotiations, you can lose, and you need to compare the expected winnings, the expected benefit of getting a negotiation, getting involved in a negotiation, to these expected costs. One of which is transaction costs. It can be very expensive to do the work necessary to prepare yourself and participate in a complicated negotiation. The second is potential reputational costs, right? Even by negotiating, even if you don't reach a deal, there could be reputational costs. The typical example here that everyone's familiar with is governments tend to say we don't negotiate with terrorists, because even if you don't reach a deal with the terrorists, you incur reputational costs. But even if you're an employee, entering into negotiations with a competitor might cause a reputational cost, even if you don't reach a deal with them. And then the final cost to keep in mind is the fact that your alternative to reaching a deal might get worse while you're negotiating in the first negotiation. So if a local car dealer advertises one car at a super low price, and there's another dealer across town who says, we'll beat any advertised offer, If you drive across town to try to get a little bit better deal from the guy across town, while you're doing that, the car that's at the great price nearby might get sold, right? So these are three kinds of costs that you need to compare to the potential value of negotiating in order to do a real expected value analysis of whether to negotiate in the way that poker players do when they're deciding whether to enter a hand.
Yeah, and actually one of the great things about poker is it just teaches you to think about expected value. You are using you're being forced over and over again, and you're just doing it hundreds and hundreds of times a night. You're just sort of practicing this process of using your gut and your experience and just what you know about your opponent. You're taking all this stuff in to assign certainly a very uncertain, but you're assigning some sort of percentage to a potential outcome. And you're assigning other percentages to other outcomes. There could be multiple outcomes in any hand. And then you are assessing what those outcomes will cost you or benefit you. And then you're adding up all that and you're coming up with an EV. You start thinking in terms of EV. And in fact, Jack has a great story up there with the guy trying to buy the casino, where he feels like there was a terrible EV analysis by someone who was in the middle of a negotiation.
Oh, you mean about overplaying your hand?
Yes, about overplaying the hand there, yeah.
This actually happened. I went up to Illinois, and there was 2 casinos up there that were for sale, and another casino company had been negotiating on it. And they'd come pretty much to a price, but the guy trimmed it down $20 million. This was about a $600 million deal. And he held out for this $20 million. Now, these casinos were a real bird's nest on the ground. There was a lot of value in them that at least $250 million of value left over here. I undercut him and I ended up at the casinos. So for the $20 million, trying to save that $20 million, he basically was laying 7 or 8 to 1 that they had to go for this. Terrible odds. So there's a case of overplay in your hand, and it costs.
And there are lots of guys who will go through life having made that poor decision, and it worked out because it was still, even if let's just say it was 80% to work out. Well, it means 80% of the time, this casino owner would have actually saved $20 million and be patting himself on the back, going, "Wow, that was a great $20 million I saved." When actually the expected value of the decision to extend the negotiations was negative expectation, because it was a 20% chance he was going to lose the $200 million in value.
Something just came up today, and me and Annie were talking earlier about thinking in odds, because we all make judgments. But by thinking in odds and prices, gaming prices, it really helps my judgment. Today, something came up where they said, okay, these guys wanted $600,000 more for something. And I said, listen, these SOBs are bluffing. Then I got the guy, my nephew, he said, listen, this land's going to be worth $6 million. I'm thinking, God damn, it's not 9 to 1, 10 to 1 that they're bluffing. It settled me right back down, because I thought about it. Otherwise, I might have just said, come on, let's call their bluff. Yeah. But by saying, listen, I'm not going to lay any 10 to 1 that they're bluffing. So anyway, that's...
I also just want to bring up one thing, just another danger about entering into a negotiation before you decide whether it's plus equity or not, and just saying, well, there's no harm in negotiating. Because you see this in poker all the time, is that once a player gets involved in a hand, they become very protective of whatever resources they might already have in the hand. And they're likely to continue in the hand in situations where the math is bad in order to protect the resources. So if you do enter a negotiation because you just think, well, there's no harm in getting into negotiation, you do risk wanting to protect your time and resources that you put into the negotiation and try to come to a conclusion in order to justify what you've done. And so I think you're actually more likely to end up with a bad result out of a negotiation that you haven't thought about very hard in advance, where you just say, well, we'll just start negotiating and see where it goes, because you want to be protective of the process.
Yeah, so in poker, right, sometimes the best thing to do is not to play.
Yes.
And in negotiation, it's important if you do get into the negotiation, right, to remember that sometimes the best outcome is an impasse. And if you can keep that in mind, then you can minimize this problem of putting too much emphasis on your sunk costs. But that always is a risk, absolutely, whenever you get into a negotiation.
Well, and actually in poker there are reputational issues. If you are the type of person that says, well, I'll just get involved in this hand because it's cheap and I can just fold, you can get the reputation as someone that can get pushed around. So every time you fold, you are sending a message to your opponents that you're someone that folds. And there's a cost to that. And so sometimes you have to make some very marginal plays. Maybe even sometimes you make decisions where if you really added up the pure costs of the call versus the fold, actually you should fold. But then when you add in the reputational cost of being someone that's known as a folder or someone that can get pushed around, it's actually you need to send the message that no, I'm not that person, I call. So you can't just look at it as, oh, I'll just dabble around a lot. Because,
right. So it can create a cascade of relatively poor decisions is the problem.
Well, and this raises a broader point.
Let's move on to the next topic, which is knowing your comfort level, because there's a lot to talk about in this one, and I want to make sure we give it the proper time. A number of years ago, there was a big stakes poker game in Las Vegas over a period of time involving a wealthy Texas banker, Andy Beal, who played against a number of professionals, one of which was Howard. And Howard, could you maybe talk about the comfort level that you and the other players had coming into it and how you counteracted that as this game went on?
Well, the player in question, Andy Beal, came to town, a very wealthy banker, also a brilliant guy. If you just look him up, he's the owner of Beal Bank, and he's just done a lot of amazing things. I think he's endowed like some very interesting math prize that I think was recently won. It was approved.
4 or 5 billion.
Yeah, and he's probably worth 4 or 5 billion now, and played the whole real estate, this whole implosion thing. He started completely divesting of real estate, I believe starting in 2004. He owned 90, to give you an idea actually of how much trouble our economy is in, I think long term, he owned 98% of his bank. He started saying, we need to get out of real estate. We need to stop having anything to do with these securities. They're all going to go bad. He started doing that in 2004, and he talks about how much pressure he got from his board. This is the guy that owns the entire bank. And it took incredible fortitude on his part to even be able to execute this strategy of actually being completely out of real estate by the time everything blew up. Of course, he was all in cash. He's probably been having a good couple of years here. As he's in negotiations where his comfort level is certainly a lot better, considering that he's in a cash situation and people are hamstrung and have other issues. But he came to Las Vegas and he decided that he wanted to take on the world's best poker players. He was a pretty good poker player. He had played with us a little bit. He had had a little success. I think overall he was a loser, but I think he decided that he could break us down by, he wasn't going to be able to create a full game at high enough stakes, but he felt like if he allowed us to kind of pool our resources, that he could play at such a high level that we would get out of our comfort level. And we started playing 50,000, 100,000 limit hold'em. So your average hand was in the 500,000 to $1 million range. And this was certainly much higher than any of us had ever played. But I think he made a miscalculation. He was playing against the best players in the world at the game that, at least the players that were put up to play against him, and this would just be heads-up battles. It would be him against one of us. This is what we've been doing our whole lives. Sometimes we play out of our comfort level. It's not recommended, but we've gotten pretty good at it. And we're also very good at getting into you start off out of your comfort level and you get comfortable really quickly with it. And I think that certainly happened with us. I think on the other hand, he never found his comfort level. And if you focus too much on just the money, yes, he was comfortable with the stakes that he was playing, but he was playing poker against the best poker players in the world. He's a banker. There's just, even if he's comfortable playing poker against his buddies, there's no chance that he's going to be comfortable in a situation where he lacks confidence. So when you are confident in what you are doing, you are comfortable with the level at which you are doing it, you are tapping into, neural pathways that have been well worn. You're good at this. Your brain is functioning well. It makes these good decisions. These are well worn pathways. As soon as you get out of your comfort level, I'm actually of the belief that literally nearly, it's almost like a temporary brain damage kicks in. These decision processes that have come so naturally to you throughout your poker career literally become physically impossible. There's like electrical stuff going on in your brain that you're not used to dealing with. As Annie has mentioned, your limbic system's getting in the way of your frontal your frontal cortex. You aren't able to make these decisions physically, and you see it all the time. And I believe that he was in that position, not because of the money, but because he was in a situation where he wasn't comfortable. And I don't think he really ever got comfortable with that game.
Is there a business and negotiation corollary to that, where you're negotiating in an unfriendly or an unknown environment, Jack or Russ?
Oh, I didn't hear.
Is there a business corollary to that same point of being in an uncomfortable negotiation or an uncomfortable situation?
Well, I think there are two things that can happen in that situation. I think one is the one Howard pointed out, that you can, when you're not in your comfort zone, you might not be making careful, rational calculations that maximize your expected value. You might be making poor decisions. Another aspect is that you might just behave in a very risk-averse way. Right? You might demand much higher odds of winning before you're willing to put your money in the pot, or in negotiation you might demand a much higher expected payout before you're willing to enter into a deal. The first of those two problems is the same in negotiation as it is in poker, right? You don't want to be in a situation where your rational cognition is being overwhelmed and not able to function properly, not able to determine what your reservation value is, what's the most highest expected value response to an offer by the other side. That's, I think, the same in both situations. The fact that you might behave in a more risk-averse way is deadly in poker, because you need that small advantage that Howard and Annie were talking about. If you have a 52% chance at the hand on even money, you've got to have your money in there if you're going to be a good poker player. In negotiation, I think the consequences of being risk-averse are probably a little less. That you're not in a situation where you're playing hand after hand after hand after hand, and you have to take advantage of that small edge. Most negotiators can be a little more risk-averse, and you'll pass up some potentially positive expected value deals, but you'll still live to negotiate another day in the way that you won't in poker, because your stack's going to be depleted very quickly if you're not really sharp with your expected value.
Yeah, but actually that's where it gets interesting. I agree with you in terms of there are businesses and business people and lawyers and whatever that get very good at certain types of negotiation. And that's because they're in their comfort zone. They're used to it, and they're willing to, nope, you know what, I'm just going to pass on this situation, I'll do this situation. I think where people have a really hard time, and it happens in poker when you're at that, it's coming up this weekend, you're at the final table of the main event, it's your once in a lifetime. You've been building a business your whole life, and now you're making the big cash out negotiation. There is no other negotiation. The pressure, you are out of your comfort zone. You aren't negotiating for a good price from a vendor who's like delivering, napkins and tablecloths to you. You may be very good at that kind of negotiation, getting a good deal, working with the right person, but now you're selling the whole business. It's your big life's negotiation, all in this one situation. And certainly there are situations in poker, particularly in poker tournaments, where you have to deal with that. And those situations come up, and sometimes you really can't help it. And you need to try and learn to function well, even when you are out of your comfort zone.
So just as an example, so speaking about the Andy Beal situation, one of the things that the players did that were playing in that situation, remember they're playing heads up, so they're allowed to do this, there's nothing funky about this, was they said, well look, not a single one of us can't come up with enough money to make sure we're in our comfort zone playing against this guy. But if we all pool our money together, then at least money-wise, no individual will feel like this is going to be life-changing if we lose. you see situations all the time in poker where someone will look at a game and they'll say, wow, this game looks really good, but it's like 3 levels above what I normally play, but I see that this guy who usually plays in my little game is over there drunk, losing in this big game, and so I'm willing to put 40% of my bankroll on the table in order to play in this game. Well, now that person's under tremendous amount of bankroll pressure. They know that if they go broke, they're going to decimate their bankroll. And what will happen is that they'll make these extremely conservative decisions, right? That over time, they might not go broke to that because they're not just spewing their money on the table, but they might not actually be acting at a positive earn. And I've actually been in business negotiations where I can sort of see the same thing, and it generally tends to be where you're negotiating for assets that you really need as a business. So if you're negotiating for assets that you desperately need as a business, you're going to tend to be out of your comfort level because you essentially have your whole bankroll on the table there where you feel like your business really needs this. I was actually just involved in a negotiation where I'm doing a startup right now, and we really needed an asset to operate our business. So what I did as a strategy, since they put me in as the lead negotiator, was I set up a lease option first on this asset where we could lease this asset for a couple of years, and then we went in and negotiated about what the larger scale of the deal might be, and it allowed me quite a bit of comfort in that negotiation because I set myself up where my whole bankroll wasn't on the table, that I knew I could have access to the asset while I was negotiating for a more thorough, ownership kind of line on what that asset was. So you can do things like that going into a business where you can say, this is an asset that I really need. I know it's going to put me out of my comfort level. Let me figure out how I can make sure that I'm not negotiating from a point of being scared, which is, I think, really what being out of your comfort level causes you to do.
Andy, can you talk, the next topic we have is one that we'll just spend a few minutes on because the last one is the bluffing, lying, and deception, where there's so much material. But with respect to emotion, we had a conversation earlier about emotion and sexism and how you deal with that in your play and who winds up being emotional at the table.
Yeah, so obviously I happen to work in a business which is very male-oriented. To give you an idea, since I started playing in the World Series of Poker, the first time I entered the main event, it was 1994, 3% of that field was women. And believe it or not, in 2010, 3% of the field was women. So that hasn't actually changed very much. What that means is that when I'm sitting at a table, it's a very unusual circumstance that there might be another woman at the table. Now, poker's become much more mainstream now, but when I first started playing, particularly because I was playing in Montana, which is, as far as I can tell, the home of the Marlboro Man. Actually, you're very familiar with Montana. The men there tended to be even more macho than the normal poker player, and the normal poker player tends to have a lot of testosterone going on. So what I found was that players were having extremely emotional reactions to me that were just kind of built into the way that men in that area were socialized. So I sort of divided them into 3 categories. One was the person who wanted to sleep with you, and it was very easy to take advantage of that person. I mean, not by actually sleeping with any of them, which I didn't. But I just figured out very quickly that if somebody wants to sleep with you, they don't want to take your money because they figured pretty quickly that was probably counterproductive to their ultimate goal. And then there were 2 kinds of other players. One was the person who just couldn't stand the thought of losing to a woman ever. And what that meant was that person was never going to allow you to bluff them, which was really good because it meant they would call you every time you bet. And there were very easy ways, and they were probably going to try to bluff you too much because they were just sort of asserting their masculinity over you. It was obviously, once you recognized that guy, it was pretty easy to take advantage of them. And then there was a third guy who just didn't respect your intellect or your creativity, so they actually assumed that there was a one-to-one relationship between how strong or weak you were and how you acted at the table. If you bet, you have to be strong because you couldn't think any more deeply than one level. And if you checked, you were obviously weak because, again, you couldn't think any more deeply than one level. Now, a lot of fellow women that I knew would get very offended by this kind of behavior at the table, and they would get offended by when men were acting poorly to them and calling them names and behaving in this way and saying, hey, Missy, and wow, you're hot, or whatever it might be, that might be inappropriate. I once beat somebody in a hand and they called me frigid, which was, I thought, a weird reaction to it, but whatever. But the point was that what I would see from a lot of women is that they would sort of go on attack mode and start behaving emotionally right back to the person. Whereas I was always very calm about it, because what I realized is that if these people are so deeply and emotionally embedded into my presence at the table, they're probably not thinking well. I may have had an advantage knowing how the brain works from my time in graduate school when I was once a scientist. But so what I took a very unemotional reaction to it, and I just said, well, if they're going to be acting emotionally, that's probably to my advantage. And I always kept in mind what my goal in the game was, for me to be making the best decisions in relation to my opponents. And any emotional reaction to the way that someone might have been treating at the table would have been extremely counterproductive to that. So.
I want to move on to the next topic because it's one that we're going to spend a fair bit of time on, which is bluffing, lying, and deception. And there's so much material here. Jack, you mentioned the negotiation you had earlier today where with the $600,000 and you thought that they were bluffing. How about when you're bluffing in a negotiation? In what circumstances is it better for you to bluff versus being totally transparent?
Well, okay, it's totally, like, the negotiations are this wide. We start negotiating when we're babies, really. I mean, you want some milk, you start crying. That's a negotiating tool. And as serious as the Cold War was basically one big bluff, one big negotiation. So there's a lot of different kinds of negotiations. Now, a lot of times, and I think Russell can say this better than me, a lot of times, and this isn't appropriate sort of poker so much as you're trying to work with the guy and come to a resolution where, like pricing, you just flat, you form a strategy, and you form a strategy from the information you have about him. And by the way, it's very important to really do your homework and figure out what his hand is, in effect, where you get the strategy. Now, you take that strategy, and if it calls for lying, or which we all do, you don't make your best price. You try to save some money out of it.
Well,
I know that was a little bit hacked up, but at least you got the point.
Well, you mentioned lying, and Russell, in business and in poker, the rules probably are slightly different about lying, but I assume there's a little bit of area in poker where lying is generally not okay, such as not throwing enough money into a pot if you're supposed to be calling for 10.
There's a difference between lying. Okay, it's one thing when you say you lie. In other words, if I misrepresent that, look, I'm going to sell you a gold mine, and this gold mine, I guarantee it's full of gold and doesn't have any gold in it. But there's remedies for that. The one thing that both sides don't have, and which you're perfectly willing to lie, and that's this. Only I know what my bottom line is. Only he knows what his bottom line is. So you can call it lying, misleading, or whatever. It's lying. You're saying I want my bottom line is 5, and maybe it's 20. So and that's perfectly ethical and permissible.
So yeah, I just want to make a distinction between lying and bluffing because I get asked this all the time. What's it like to lie all the time? People say to me, and I say to them, actually, I don't lie hardly ever, and it's one of the biggest offenses in my household that my children can make is to lie. Because when you sit down at a poker table, there are rules to the game. And part of the rule is that you don't have to show your cards. Now, the way you show your cards to your opponents is by the way that you bet. That what I tell people is that your chips are your language. You're not actually speaking to people like you are in negotiation. You're using your chips to say, well, this is what I think my hand is worth. And then the other person says, oh, that's too much, I fold. Or they say, no, I think my hand is worth the same amount. Or they say, oh, I think my hand is worth more than that. And that's what you're doing with your chips, is you're discussing with the other person through use of your chips what each of you values your hand at. When you sit down at the table, you have agreed to the rules that you're trying to keep your hand hidden. So I actually get a little bit offended when people equate bluffing with lying. Lying is misrepresenting the facts in a way that's malicious, right? Unless your wife asks you if she looks good in the jeans, and then you should just say yes. but big lies, But bluffing is a different thing. It's saying within the construct of this game, I am allowed to keep my hand as hidden as possible while we have a conversation where we're trying to come to an agreement. right? So,
Well, but there is a place where lying, where you actually do lie at the poker table, and it is part of the game and totally acceptable. And that is because within the rules of the game, when you make a bet, and you have now successfully negotiated that your opponent will fold, your opponent has no right to see your cards.
Right.
That's the key, that's the essence of the game. And if your opponent asks you, what did you have?
oh, well, you don't.
It is your obligation to lie to them.
But I don't really think of that as a lie. Again, I think that's sort of. But I think the interesting thing, I think there's two really interesting things that you can learn from bluffing in the game. And the first has to do with when it's appropriate to bluff, and the second has to do with how you execute a bluff properly, which are two totally separate issues, and I think people kind of conflate them. When you're thinking about when it's appropriate to bluff, it really has to do with understanding the texture of the game that you're in and who your opponents are. Because what I always try to get people to understand is that people will say to me, oh, well, in these games where everybody just calls everything, isn't it no fun because you're not playing poker? And I say, well, you're making a mistake about equating bluffing with poker, being a good poker player. And I think in negotiations, people try to bluff too often because they think, oh, in order to be a good negotiator, I must be deceptive and I must bluff. But it's not always appropriate to do so. It's really just a tool that you use in your negotiations.
Well, and particularly in negotiations where you're forming partnerships. I mean,
right.
There are two very different, there's just
right.
the pricing negotiation, you're just getting some commodity
some
service
commodity,
and you're trying to get a cheap
or you might want to have
price.
a partnership. So, yeah, so what I tell people is this, that bluffing has two bits of value, and we can divide it very clearly. There's the present equity in the bluff, which is if I make this bluff, will I actually put money in my stack? And that could be either because you get something at a lower price than you were willing to pay, which is obviously locking equity up, or whatever, or whatever it might be. So in poker, that would be, if I execute the bluff, will the pot actually go into my stack? And there's some percentage chance that will happen when you execute the bluff. But then there's the reputational issue, right? Which is, okay, well let's say that the bluff gets caught, and I get caught. So it's in a negotiation, I offer low, but then they go a little bit higher, and I agree to that. You're protecting your reputation when you get caught, because then people know that your first offer isn't always your bet, isn't the highest that you're willing to go, and that's extremely important for you to let people know that. And in poker, if you get caught, they know that when you bet, you're not always having the best hand. So what I tell people is, if those two things don't exist, then you shouldn't be bluffing. So if you're in a game where you know that if you bet, there's no possibility, given the lay of your opponents, that that pot will ever go into your stack, and then you ask the follow-up question of, well, if it doesn't go in my stack, am I going to teach my opponents anything that's valuable to me in the future about the way that I behave in these situations? And the answer is no, because these opponents call you, they might as well have blindfolds on. Right? So we get into situations where people will say to me, wow, I folded every hand for an hour and then I raised and I still got 5 callers. Those people aren't paying attention to your actions. They're not paying attention to your reputation. So it would be silly to bluff in that situation. And I think there's similar cases that come up in business where that's also true, where your opponents are just they're gonna go as high as they want, or where you're forming a partnership where you want to have a long-term reputation of actually not bluffing. You want to have a long-term reputation of honesty with those people. And you need to really think about not just, I want to be a good negotiator, which I equate with going in low, right? But more, what is the nature of my relationship with the people I'm negotiating with, and is this an appropriate tool to apply at this moment?
And some people just don't get that it's a game and that these are part of the rules. There's actually a funny story years ago, and I'm sure Jack can attest to this story. Doyle Brunson was trying to get licensed by the Nevada Gaming Control Board to be, I guess it was a cardroom host or cardroom manager.
Cardroom manager.
And one of the members of the control board had a real issue with the fact that Doyle Brunson made a living check raising. And you're a check raiser. You are not suitable for a license in this town. And I mean, he had to overcome this perception that because he's a bluffer and he's doing this game where sort of deceit's part of the game, that maybe he wasn't the type of person that should get a cardroom license.
Well, speaking of deceit being part of the game, let's take a look at a hand involving Phil Hellmuth and Antonio Esfandiari, which is a very interesting hand, and then you guys can talk about the bluff at the end of it.
Here we go.
We have cards. Let's light this candle. Cameras and this and that.
So this hand counts, right?
No mulligans. First tee shot plays. Haxton, 9-8. Folds. Mercier's out. Phil. Ace-6.
Pot. What is it?
It is pot limit pre-flop. Phil raises to 2,000.
You got a nice hand to start with, Phil?
The needling has already started.
These two have quite a history.
The cannon folds. Jacks for Esfandiari, who calls. And Tony G's in as well.
Can you beat ace-9 offsuit? I know you can, Tony.
I can't. That's for sure. I wish.
Phil has Tony dominated, but Antonio has them both in bad shape.
The flop, 10-8-10, a gut shot for Tony G. Antonio still with the best hand, and he's first to act.
Antonio probably likes his hand on this board.
So much so, he leads out, betting 4,400. Tony G folds.
Antonio doesn't want to give a free card, and on a board like that, he knows he can get called by ace high. Phil might think he has the best hand in this spot.
Raise it.
Announces a raise to 14-4.
Antonio can't really like the flop raise, but the likelihood that Phil has him beat on that board is pretty slim. Now, if Phil had a good hand here, there wouldn't be a real point in raising. There's only a couple draws to protect against, and we all know Phil's a big trapper.
Antonio calls, and it's already a juicy pot.
Good game, Phil.
The turn, 3 of spades. Esfandiari checks.
Antonio's checking to the aggressor. He might like his hand, but he doesn't want to bet and get raised. That would make him more likely to be playing for his whole stack on the river. Phil's got to decide if he wants to fire another barrel. If Antonio had something Phil thought he could fold on the flop, that 3 probably didn't help him.
Phil bets 17,000.
This is more indicative of the kind of bet Phil would make if he really did like his hand. Antonio's probably realizing that making this call will basically put the rest of his stack in play on the river on the very first hand of this game.
Antonio calls.
Phil's got a pretty slim chance of actually making the winning hand.
The river, the 5 of diamonds. Antonio checks.
We've got almost $70,000 in this pot, and Antonio has stuck with Phil the whole way. If Phil wants to win this pot, he will have to fire a third barrel. Phil's trying to decide if he can make Antonio fold and just what that perfect size barrel is to get the job done. The Winchester, the 12 gauge, or the howitzer.
Wow. Sorry I'm taking so long, guys.
Tony seems cool with it.
Phil finally bets 22 grand.
Should get an Academy Award for that one.
Phil's chosen to make a fairly small bet, less than 1/3 of the pot. Antonio could interpret this as a classic McHelmuth extra value meal, and he's not loving it.
Ace-10, huh?
Nope.
Translation, OMG, please fold.
And OMG, Antonio does.
Show the bluff, Phil. Bluff?
That's a nice start for you, Phil, isn't it? Beautiful.
Yes, yes.
Howard, what do you think?
Me? No, I'm going to leave it to Annie. She wants to jump right in.
I love this hand because there are so many things that go wrong with this hand. It's astonishing. Both players actually play the hand quite poorly. So this is a very interesting situation, this 10-10-8 board, and not to promote the book that I have coming out, but I have one coming out in February. I actually have a chapter on literally that situation when the board comes paired like that. And you're sitting there with a hand. What I talk about is there's very often situations in poker, and this goes back to the very first thing we talked about, which is about whether you have clarity on your hand as you're going first in a hand. There are very many situations that come up in poker where you may very well have the best hand, but there's no way for you to be sure that you have the best hand. And Antonio's in one of these situations when the board comes 10-10-8 and he has 2 jacks. He may very well have the best hand, and when he has the best hand, he has his opponent buried. But he may be buried himself. Okay, this is very important for the way the rest of the hand plays out. So thing that goes wrong for Antonio, number one. When he calls out of the position and the board comes 10-10-8, when he leads out, it's extremely unlikely that he has a 10 in his hand. Because one of the problems, and this happens for Phil on the flop as well, and I don't like Antonio's response for this reason, is that one of the gut reactions that we have when we decide we're going to execute a bluff is we say, well, if I play strong, then I'll look strong. And the problem is that instead of asking yourself, well, how can I look the strongest, you should actually ask yourself a completely different question, which is, if I were strong, how would I play? Now, I know that it sounds a little bit like you're asking the same question, but you really aren't. Because what Antonio would have realized is if I flopped a 10 here, I would never just lead into my two opponents on a board that's so dry. Dry meaning the cards aren't very related to each other. Okay, so he would have checked. Now, Phil, recognizing this, now makes the same mistake back. Well, it's very unlikely that Antonio has a 10, because if Antonio had a 10, he wouldn't have bet. But now Phil raises, but it's very unlikely that Phil has a 10. Because if Phil had a 10, how would you behave in that situation? You would call, because everybody's greedy. And you know that the greedy play is to just call there and not to raise. So Antonio actually sensed this properly. I was very happy when Antonio called on the flop. Because if Antonio had been playing a 10 in a tricky way, that's exactly what he would have done. But where the hand goes wrong for Antonio is on the turn. Because when Antonio checks on the turn, and Phil now kindly continues with the second barrel bluff, and he bets, Antonio should have said to himself, I have two problems. One is I'm trying to represent a 10, so how would a 10 actually play in this situation? But number two is I have to go first on the next street. So if I'm going to represent a 10, then the only way a 10 could play would be to call and then bet the river, because a 10 wouldn't want to risk it going check on the river. Okay, because I can't guarantee, knowing that I have a 10 in my hand, that my opponent will bet twice for me. So if I'm going to call here, I must bet out. But had he actually thought another step, he said, aha, but the way that a 10 would actually have acted is that when I let out and I got raised and I flat called, I would only be checking on the turn in order to go for a check raise, which is exactly what a 10 would do. And had he thought it through, he would have realized, a check raise works really well for a hand that I don't know whether it's the best hand or not. And the reason why is that if you check raise, queens, kings, and aces fold. So what it allows you to do is say, I'm going to play this hand in a way where I'm playing it kind of like a bluff, but I might actually be playing for value. But I'm playing for value in a way that the 10 would actually play, and I get the added bonus of getting all these hands that are better than mine to fold, and I stop myself from having to do this weird thing on the river, which is call the turn and then just lead out and hope. Because if I play it that way, the aces will call me on the river. So this, if I'm going to bet the river anyway, and this is a really key thing in bluffing theory, if I'm going to make that bet on the river anyway, I might as well move that river money over to the turn, use that money I would bet on the river, or check call on the river, which is what he should have done, use it as a raise on the turn instead, which now allows me to actually bluff a lot of hands out and tell the actual story of a 10. So it was a pretty deep hand, actually. It was a very interesting hand. I don't know how much of that you guys caught, but it was kind of a fun hand. I like talking about hands like that.
Well, we've got one more.
And the reason it worked for Phil, the reason it worked for Phil, just very simply, and certainly when you're bluffing during a negotiation, you have to do the same thing, and that is at least he was telling a coherent story.
After the initial misstep on the flop.
Right. Well, yeah. But if he had queens, kings, or aces,
right,
it's quite likely that he would have played the hand the way he played it.
Right, because once he gets a check on the river, aces can
And the one thing you can't do in poker is all of a sudden start convincing your opponent that you have a certain hand if you didn't play it the way that that hand would have played earlier, because then they'll just smell a rat. And so you have to tell a coherent story that adds up.
Right, so from Antonio's perspective, by the way, he may have very much believed that he wasn't getting bluffed, because while it would have been pretty easy for him to figure out that Phil didn't have a 10 in his hand, it would have felt very much like Phil had queens, kings, or aces, because the line that Antonio took...
And particularly the small bet on the river, trying to extract maximum value from a hand like jacks, feels like a big pair.
Feels like a big pair. Now, again, had Antonio gone one level deeper, he would have said, he has queens, kings, or aces. If I check raise the turn, he has to fold. So there was a lot of interesting things that happened in that hand.
Well, there are a lot of really interesting issues here. I'm going to set aside for a minute the ethical questions. We talked about those a little bit. If we have time, Joe, I'd love to come back to those. But let me just make a point about tactics in negotiation versus poker. Here's a place where I think that there is an important distinction between negotiation and poker. In poker, the fundamental theorem of poker, right, as it's been called, is you always want the other person, you want to convince the other person that you have what you don't have. So if you have a strong hand, you want him to think you're weak. If you have a weak hand, you want him to think you're strong.
Well, that's not always true, but okay.
Usually, right?
No, there's actually a good percentage of the time that you don't want to, and that's exactly those situations where the board is kind of ugly. And in those situations, you actually, when you have a strong hand, you want your opponent to believe you have a strong hand.
Okay, well then, in that situation, that's more like the situation in negotiation,
right.
where in negotiation there are some exceptions to this also, but generally, if you're weak, you want your opponent to think you're strong, because then they're likely to make concessions, and you'll get more of the cooperative surplus of the deal. When you're strong, you also want your opponent to think you're strong. You don't want him to think you're weak, because if he thinks you're weak, that's an invitation to not make any concessions and demand more and more and more. So the difference here between poker and negotiation, I think, here's one place where this odd fact about poker really makes a difference in the tactics, which is in poker, if your opponent thinks you're weak, that will cause him to bet and put money in the pot, which you can then win. This aspect of poker doesn't exist. There's no analog to this usually in negotiation. You can make up a story for where it is. For example, if the other person's giving you professional services, for example, and hoping that you will then enter into a deal with them, you might want them to think that you're weak, meaning that you really need these services and you'll pay a lot for them, so that they will give you these things before you enter into a deal. That's an unusual situation in negotiation. Usually, there's no benefit to your opponent thinking that you're weak like there is in poker. So this strong when weak, weak when strong thing that you see often in poker doesn't apply to negotiation. You always want the person to think you're strong. One other important tactical difference is that because poker is a completely zero-sum game, right? You're battling over the pot, and there's no way to create more value than what's in the pot. If I get the chips, Jack doesn't get the chips. If Jack gets them, I don't get them. In negotiation, there are often lots of ways. Probably everyone here has heard the term win-win negotiation. There are often ways to add things to the negotiation, rejigger the negotiation in a way that everybody's made better off. And to the extent that you're not transparent, it makes it harder to take advantage of those opportunities in negotiation. This isn't usually a problem in poker because you're trying to battle over that zero-sum pot, so you don't have that factor playing in.
There's one more hand we're going to give you a chance to comment on, because I know you enjoy it, and this is a Joe Hatcham, Daniel Negreanu hand.
Action begins on Joe Hashem because Daniel is straddled.
I picked up a flush draw. I had a queen high flush draw. On the river I did.
No, you did.
Still talking about the last hand. Hashem raised to 2,500.
It's a pretty loose raise, unsuited under the gun.
Action folds around to the cannon, who's out. Fours for the straddler, who calls. The flop, ace, 8, 10, all spades. Daniel, the only one with a spade, and checks. Hashem, middle pair.
35.
Makes it 3,500 to go.
35.
Daniel will sometimes have the best hand in this spot.
And he calls.
He's got the best draw.
King of spades on the turn, giving Daniel a flush.
This is a weird spot for Daniel because you're either way ahead or way behind.
He fires 5,000.
Daniel's thinking that without a spade, Joe would pretty much have to give up this hand. He doesn't appear to be giving up.
Nope, he raises to 13,000.
Daniel's bet was pretty small. Maybe Joe sensed weakness and decided to try to make a move on him.
Daniel calls.
Move hasn't worked so far.
Jack of clubs on the river, giving Joe 2 pair. Daniel checks his flush.
Joe's got 2 pair, but he's going to have to rep bigger if he wants Daniel to fold. Let's see how badly he wants to blow Daniel off his hand.
How's 28,000?
This is a bluff designed specifically to get Daniel to fold exactly the type of hand he's got, a weak spade. Let's see if it works.
I feel like flipping a coin, but then I'll hope it comes to call. you ever do that? Oh, yeah. Flip a coin, but you want it to be called at the end? Okay, I don't have the queen of spades. Just want to make that clear.
Sure, Joe likes that.
Thing is, I've seen you do this before. Who was it against? It was Howard Lederer.
You remember that?
Yes, and it was 4 flush, and
That
you didn't have
was
anything.
So long ago.
Yeah, and you just totally bluffed him in the same exact spot. Where you raised the turn, you bet the river, and you didn't have it, and he folded a better hand. And I feel like you might do the same thing.
Total recall.
See, if I knew you watched television, I wouldn't do the same thing, would I?
There's only one problem, Daniel. If you watch TV, nobody would ever try to bluff you. I'm just trying to tell you. If you've ever watched, nobody would try to bluff you.
Oh, man, I was going to fold. I mean, I was going to call, and now I think I might fold. Damn it.
Even though Daniel's got a flush, it's only a bluff catcher at this point. No worse hand would ever bet this for value.
We made a real good show yesterday.
I changed my mind. I don't know, my first instinct was call, and I'm folding.
Daniel folds.
Oh!
Bad?
Sorry, Joe.
Did you show a spade?
And Joe shows.
Oh, I knew I should have my first instinct. I had the 4 of spades.
Wow.
High five.
All your table talk, won it for him.
Do you want to take this?
No, you can go first.
Okay, so this is a great hand. So when Daniel calls out a position, we're going to go way back to talking about going first and the problems with going first, because that's very wrapped up in what happens with this hand. When he calls out a position, a hand like 2-4s is one of these hands that's going to be very difficult to play out of position. And the reason why it's going to be very difficult to play out of position is that you're only really happy with the flop about 12.5% of the time, which is exactly when a 4 happens to hit the board. The other 88% of the time, you're going to have left the lead with the other person, meaning the aggressor. He's taking the aggressive stance in this negotiation, and so he's the one who's going to be the natural better after the flop. So most of the time you're going to be checking, that person's going to bet, and that person's going to bet in a way that has such a wide range that it doesn't do anything to further define the hand for you, because it's a natural bet for him, and now you're just going to be kind of stuck in the hand, which is really what happens to Daniel here. So he calls on the flop, and interestingly enough, it appears that his plan is to bet the turn. But the problem here again, and this has to go with going first, is that if Daniel actually had a very good hand on the turn, he wouldn't bet out. And it goes back to what we're saying about if we assume, and excuse my language, but this is the rule that I call it, because I think people remember it, that everybody at poker, I call it the greedy bastard rule, that every single person that you're playing against is just a greedy bastard. So if you assume that they're acting from a place of being greedy, then you can know everything about them. And if Daniel were truly a greedy person, which he is, because he's sitting at a poker table, not because he's Daniel, no, just because so is my brother when he's sitting at a poker table, and so am I. We're all greedy. If he had the queen of spades in his hand, he would be very unlikely just to lead into Joe Hashem there, knowing that he held the queen of spades, and it would be unlikely that Joe would be able to make any continue there. So when he bets out, he's either being super deceptive or he's just trying to find out if his hand is good. And the problem is that Joe is a smart enough player to realize that a person betting in a way that looks like it's designed to find out if his hand is good doesn't know his hand is good. So therefore, it must be vulnerable, because otherwise he would already know. So when he bets out, Joe rightly says, well, I think most of the time that I see that bet, it's Daniel trying to figure out if his hand is good. So I'm now going to inform him that it's not. Now, once he raises, when Daniel calls, Hashem can say, well, it's weird that he called, because it feels like if he had the queen of spades, he would have to bet here. He would have to raise here for the reason that I know he has to go first on the next card. And so if he had the queen of spades here, if he has to go first on the next card, he's going to have to bet the river anyway, because if he checks, he can't risk it getting checked behind.
Right, but he could just call deceptively with the queen of spades, and then lead out.
And then lead out. So Joe's saying, well, most of the time that he flat calls here, I think that's very weird, and he probably doesn't have the queen of spades, but I'll know for sure by whether he bets on the river or not. So the minute that Daniel checks the river, Joe knows he doesn't have the queen of spades.
Basically, Joe can only bet the queen of spades.
Right.
Pretty much. Maybe the second best spade.
He could probably bet the jack of spades,
but
too.
the thing is that by the time we get to the river, Joe knows that Daniel doesn't have the queen of spades.
Because Daniel
and he
has
has
to go
played
first.
the hand in a completely, again, having your story add up.
Consistent.
He has played his hand in a completely consistent manner, as though he had
the queen of spades or the jack of spades. He can have one of those two hands. And
What do you
I think
think
the
of
most
the
interesting.
comment? What do you think about the comment, though? I don't have the queen of spades.
Well, he's not. Daniel's never going to check raise there, so it doesn't matter.
He's not giving away any information.
He's not giving away information because he's not going to check raise.
Joe
But
already figured that one out.
Right. So, but I think that that's what's really key there is that Daniel actually says out loud what Joe already knows. So he says, well, just in case you're wondering, I don't have the queen of spades. And Joe could have said, really? No, duh. Everybody knows that. And it really has to do with that fact that the problem with going first is that you lose your optionality, right? That once Daniel calls on the turn, in fact, when he calls on the flop, he's got to have decided what the turn's going to be, right? And he just has to lead out. And then when he calls on the turn, he needed to have already thought, well, what are my options on the river? How am I actually going to represent a hand? Because if I check, I can't stop Joe from betting. I'm not representing a queen. My only option would be to bet out. Whereas Joe gets to say, well, when Daniel calls on the turn, I'm going to leave my options open to me depending on what Daniel actually does on the river, because what he does will actually tell me what I have.
Both of those hands come down to the greatness of poker in that
Right.
both Antonio's play and Daniel's play are very reasonable if they are correct in their prediction of the strategy.
Right.
They were thinking, well, there's a pretty good chance I have the best hand, and they're correct both times. But they make the decision, okay, I can call here on 4th Street because, in my opinion, my opponent's strategy will be
to
check on the river. They won't continue the bluff. And in both of these cases, and of course these are the hands that show up on TV, the really spectacular plays, it is hard to continue the bluff street after street after street. That's a hard thing to do. And that's the beauty of poker. So you could argue both Daniel and Antonio made fine plays. They correctly figured out that they're likely have the best hand. What they miscalculated was their opponent's strategy if they had the best hand. And they fall down the river to a brilliantly executed bluff in both cases.
Going back to this idea that if you're in a situation where you're that unsure, and I think that your statement is absolutely true, I likely have the best hand, but I don't really know. Daniel, if he had re-raised, could have said, well, look, if I re-raise here on the turn, then I know that most spades will fold. In fact, the jack of spades might even fold. So now I'm only fading one card in Joe Hasham's hand, which is the queen of spades. If he has a queen of spades, whatever. But if I re-raise here, I'm only raising the pot. So he only has to not have the queen of spades in his hand 50% of the time in order for me to break even on the play. That's pretty sweet. So if he was going to go ahead and call and commit money there in a situation where he's really unsure, he should have just gone ahead and played it like a bluff anyway, realizing that he picks up all the fold equity along with it. And that's what you kind of learned from both situations, that in the case where you're unsure, you should just go ahead and represent
But
strength.
that's a tough play. You really look foolish when you make that play and your opponent has the queen of spades, because you know what? They were saying they had the queen of spades all along. And that's actually part of the negotiation of a poker hand. What kind of embarrassment are you willing to risk? You know, I've always said that that one of the great strengths of Phil Ivey is he has no fear, and he doesn't care if he looks like a fool, and people feel it at the table. He's capable sometimes when you are thinking about, well, what could my opponent have? And that comes into what do they have and what is their strategy? Sometimes you can go, you know what, they just couldn't be bluffing here because it would look so ridiculous. Well, you know what? The fact that Phil Ivey's willing to look ridiculous like that and not have it like damage him psychically somehow, you know, that gives him power at the table. The fact that he's willing to suffer the pain of an embarrassing play.
Right, but I think also just going back to the going first thing, what Howard just said is true, that, you know, when I give you the analysis, you're all like, well, if I were in that situation, I would have re-raised with the 4s, because Annie just made that sound so easy. Or if I were in Antonio's situation, I would have re-raised with the jacks, because Annie just made that so easy, because I'm sitting here armchair quarterbacking. It is very difficult when you're in the situation, and that's what brings up the problem with going first, is that in order to execute those kinds of plays first, they tend to be very expensive. Notice that Phil's bluff line was very cheap. He bet small, and then he bet small again, and then he bet small again, and he kept giving himself these prices that were in the 2-to-1 and 3-to-1 range.
Over 3-to-1 on the river.
Right, where his rate of success only had to be in the 25% of the time range, right? Whereas had Antonio or a Daniel executed those bluffs, their success rate would have had to be in the 50% range. So their success rate would have had to be double. That's the problem with having to go first, is that when you go to execute these things, they tend to be much more expensive in relation to the price that the pot is laying you. Again, Joe Hashem had the benefit of seeing this really weak lead from Daniel on the turn, which gave him so much information that Daniel almost definitely didn't have the queen of spades, that now when he went ahead and made that raise on the turn and he under-raised the pot, he also gave himself about 2-to-1 on the play, saying, I'm just going to bet that 33% of the time this guy doesn't have the queen of spades in his hand, in a spot where it was like 80% that he didn't have the queen of spades in his hand. And that was the advantage of him being in position, being able to do that. And that's a big lesson, is that those two hands failed because of being out of position. And that's why the in-position player managed to win both of those.
It's a fascinating topic, and one we could go on and on and on about. We did want to give folks in the audience a chance to ask questions. So if you do have a question, if you could come up to the microphone. Before we do that, Russell, you had one ethical point that you wanted to bring up. If you could do it real short while we get.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk for a second about this question about whether it's ethical in negotiation to deceive your opponent, whether you want to call it a bluff or you want to call it a lie. And there's a lot of disagreement between scholars and commentators on the morality of this. And one of the reasons that there's disagreement is the point that Howard raised, that in poker, notwithstanding the Nevada licensing agent that you spoke about, within poker, everybody knows the rules. It's not outside of the rules to bluff. In negotiation, in most cases, it's a little unclear what the rules are. But in the case of what's legal and what's not legal to do, you can really, generally speaking, divide the world into two situations. It's legal, whether it's immoral or unethical is a different question, but it's legal to lie or deceive about what your reservation price is, or about what your private information is, how much you like your alternative to reaching a deal, what you're willing to pay for something. You're not going to. That's definitely legal to do. Just like in poker, it's legal to deceive by bluffing about the strength of your hand. It's not legal to lie in negotiation about the subject matter of the negotiation. If I'm trying to sell you my car, I can tell you I would never take less than $10,000, even though I'm willing to take $5,000, but I can't tell you that the car's never been in an accident and never been in the shop when it practically lives in the shop. Okay? Actually, this is kind of a similar thing to poker, I think, that although we usually think that in poker anything goes in terms of deception, not true. If you think of the subject matter of the negotiation in poker as the pot, rather than what's in your hand, you can't lie. For example, you can't say, I'm calling your $50 bet and throw only $30 in the pot. That's against the rules of poker. You can't throw chips in the pot that are counterfeit, right? So if you divide, so really there's probably not as much difference in the deception analysis between poker and negotiation as it often might seem.
Another point is this. Only you know your bottom line. Only he knows his bottom line. You change your bottom line. And you do this all the time in negotiations. You says, I'm not going to give this guy over $5. Now you get in there and says, gee, I've changed my mind. I'm going to give him 10. So you're, in effect, even though you're lying, you might be lying to yourself. So.
Good point.
Well, seeing no one has come forward to ask any questions, we do have one or two gentlemen. Go ahead. Please identify yourself and then ask your question.
Arlen Levitan, I'm a Las Vegas resident. One aspect I've rarely seen discussed, which does involve negotiation in poker, is negotiating chops in tournament poker. It's an interesting negotiation in that all of the players who remain have to agree to do so. Any thoughts on negotiating chops? Any stories about creative chops?
Well, I certainly have a story where they got down to 9-handed. They got down to the final table at a cheap little $500 tournament at Bellagio. At least it was cheap for Freddie D, who's a world-class player and just happened to be in the card room that night and decided to play. And he gets down to the final table and he's up against 8 players that are desperate to cash. And they ended up giving him first place money to accept the chop. There were 9 people with chips. The best he could do was win. And they let him take the prize money associated with winning the title.
That's negotiating out of your comfort zone.
Right. So he was in his comfort zone, and he was happy to continue playing. His opponents were desperate to make a deal. So certainly there are actually pure negotiations where you're playing poker, but now it's not in the hand. You're actually negotiating the prize money. Right.
Yeah, my recommendation would be, unless you have some reason to believe that somebody's a lot better than you, you should never, if you're desperate to chop, just go in there, set the rule in advance that you won't take less than your chip equity. And then again, you're not being emotional. Because what happens to people in that situation, going back to emotional decision making, is they're like, oh my gosh, I could lock this money up. And all of a sudden they're thinking emotionally, and they give up tremendous amounts of equity in terms of what their chip equity actually is. So if you just have a rule, when I go in, if someone offers me a chop, the worst that I'll ever accept is what the equity of my chip stack is, and then we'll go from there. Then you're going to avoid making that decision when you're feeling desperate to lock the money up.
Next question.
Okay, my question, sorry, my name's Chris. I'm a local Las Vegas resident as well. And my question is about the idea of, in poker specifically, the reputation or looking like a fool by playing a hand a certain way, and how that's affected by games that a player knows is going to be televised at some point, and knows that the whole cards will eventually be revealed, and at a later date someone will be able to go back and say, I know what he had. So my question is, would that ever, in your cases personally or just anecdotally, would that cause players to sometimes play a hand differently, knowing that the hand was going to be televised at some future date?
Yeah, I mean, players play very differently on TV. I think just for whatever reason, I do have an ability to just not even notice the cameras.
I do too, but I'm always relieved when I see it televised and I notice that I didn't do anything super stupid.
But I do believe there are a lot of players, and I think actually more common than being fearful of looking stupid, players want people at home to see them being heroes and making fancy plays. And definitely I think players get overly involved, try and make very elaborate bluffs.
Particularly against named players.
Yeah, and also try and make very heroic calls. And they don't play well because they know the cameras are on them, and particularly when there's an amateur player who may never ever be on TV playing poker again, is in that, talk about a comfort level. I'm playing one of maybe thousands of hands that have been and will be on TV, and this person has maybe their one chance to be able to show their family or their friends, look, I outplayed Lederer, and the fact, just the mere fact that thought has entered that player's hand is going to affect their decision-making process.
So this is a really critical difference between poker and negotiation. I think that in negotiation, what I always tell my negotiation students is, you don't judge the outcome of the negotiation, how good a negotiator you are, based on money alone, right? You judge it based on utility. Right? There are lots of things you might try to get in a negotiation that have utility other than the best financial deal. Right? You might value treating other people in a way that you think is fair, in which case that would suggest that you should try to accomplish that. You might get value in a negotiation from looking a certain way to people that are watching the negotiation, right? And like exactly in this case. But poker's judged. Generally, we judge poker in terms of money only, right? How much did you come out with compared to what you started with?
But just imagine if, as a negotiator, all of a sudden you've been a professional negotiator your whole career. This is sort of what happened to poker players. Imagine
that was the greatest thing to put on TV ever.
At the end of every negotiation, under a lie detector test, you were given a 1-hour interview about your reserve price, about your alternatives, about what you would have done, and then literally the result of the negotiation was published to the world over and over again for people to judge who got the best in the negotiation and who didn't.
It would change your behavior. But one of the things I want to say,
and that's literally what happened to us.
There was a point brought up before about thinking about equity. And how do you think about equity? And I think this is a really good spot to bring it up, which is, I think the reason why my brother and I can play the same if we're on camera, if we're not on camera, is because we're not thinking about outcomes. We're thinking about making the best play in the moment, and we're totally comfortable with understanding that those things don't always work out. Sometimes you have bad outcomes, sometimes you have good outcomes, and it doesn't really matter to us. So as long as we believe that we made the best decision given the information that we had at the moment, we're going to be fine with it. And if it turned out we failed, then thank God that's on TV, because then maybe we can see where our thinking was wrong and improve it going forward, because we view failures as opportunities, right? So where I noticed this difference in thinking was I was giving a talk once on how you make good equity decisions, and I was giving some hand examples to try to show the equity decisions. And I gave about 5 hand examples, and then someone in the audience raised their hand and said, how come you didn't tell us how any of the hands turned out? And I realized that I hadn't actually told what the result in any of the hands were, and I said, because it doesn't matter to me. That's not what the point of the decision is. And I think once you understand that and you really disconnect the decisions from the outcomes, you do much better with like exposing yourself on TV and that kind of thing, because it becomes very irrelevant to your decision-making process, which it should be.
Well, although playing on TV affects how I play poker. And the way it affects it is because I know that the person I am playing with is playing on TV.
Yes, right.
And I also know that, and this is not when I'm on TV, but I'm also very aware of the hands that I have played on television. And I actually think that I'm in a pretty fortunate situation in that there seems to be the common narrative that most poker directors like to put out there for me is that I'm a very tight conservative player. And I know that that's what's out there. And in fact, the Tournament of Champions where I played this summer, they were forwarding this narrative throughout the entire show. And then toward the end of the show, they pop up these little stat box. They'd be keeping stats at the final table. We were down to 3-handed, Huck Seed, Johnny Chan, and myself. And when you looked at aggression, I was like a 72, and you know, it's complicated what went into those numbers, and like Huck was like a 66 and Chan was like a 62. I was the most aggressive of the 3 guys. If you'd watched the show, the hands that were actually shown, it was a 12-hour final table, all distilled into a couple of hour show. You know, you would have thought I was the tightest guy in the game. So I know that tournament directors like to propagate that narrative because it's just the narrative that's out there. So, and in fact, there were a couple of aggressive plays I had made they didn't put in the show, but I know that. So I can use that to my advantage.
Next question.
Hi, my name is Joe Cintrone. I'm an entrepreneur, and so this question is more about business than poker, and it would probably apply more to Mr. Binion. Would probably be able to give me more insights on this question, but anybody on the panel, I'd appreciate advice. I'm a casino game inventor, and I'm from New Jersey, and I've had success out on the East Coast. I have games in major casinos out there. And I'm currently staying in Nevada to try to break into the market here. And we find it very difficult in order to get in the door in the Las Vegas casinos, in order just to show them the game, even though we have excellent numbers on the game. Let me just throw a number out there. Like in New Jersey, it might increase revenue an average of like $40,000 a month per unit. We have the games legalized here. We have them in a couple casinos here. Well, my question is, as a casino, a former casino owner, what would a man have to do in order to get in the door, in order to convince you to put a new game in?
Does the guy have to do what? To convince you.
Jack, he wants to know how to negotiate with you to get his game into a casino.
Well, we have the numbers on the game, yes, but what do you have to do to get in the door? Number one is to see a casino operator.
It's interesting that you said that. There's a guy right here in the audience that invented 3-card poker.
Oh, I know his story very well.
And I actually turned it down at first, and we were good friends. It was a big mistake on my part, but you should ask him because, you know, it's just a judgment call, and you have to say, well, you know, does this thing have appeal? Now, unfortunately for you, there's gotten to be so many people inventing games, and they're good games, that it's very hard now because people just turned off by it. It's like we got Caribbean Stud, we got 3-card poker, we got all these exotic games, and we've got enough of them, and that's kind of the problem that you're up against now because there's just so many of them.
Well, the difference is we had games in major casinos already, like put out on the East Coast, like Harrah's and Taj Mahal and Caesars.
Do you have a follow-up question? Because I want to make sure we get these other two guys in. 'Cause
In fact,
we're gonna have
I'll
cut
talk
it
to you
off
after.
soon.
How's that?
Thank you.
How you guys doing? My name's Ben. I'm a local Las Vegan here. My question is actually for Annie. You mentioned you say good players can add 5% to their bankroll. Is that something relative to what you said?
No, so generally, if you're a winning poker player, the average spread in terms of what you're earning for every dollar that you invest in the game is going to be between 2.5% and 5%. In general, it's extremely hard to be above 5%. Now, obviously, if you put Phil Ivey into a game with very bad players, he could be 10%. But even Phil Ivey in the game that he plays on a regular basis, which is against very good players, is only going to be in the 2.5% to 5% range. Now, there's a general rule in poker. It breaks down at the ends, and I'll explain what I mean in a sec, but there's a general rule in all gambling, which you should never bet more than your edge. So it's a very simple thing. If I offered you a game where offered you a bet where you had, let's say that the bet was going to hit 20% of the time, right? Which is a 4-to-1 shot, but I was offering you 8-to-1 on the bet, you still wouldn't bet 100% of the money that you have on earth, right? Because even though you're earning huge on that would be crazy to do, right? Because you know that 80% of the time you're going to lose, right? Even though I'm paying you as if you're only going to win, you only need to win at 10% of the time.
There's a betting strategy called the Kelly criteria, which says that you should bet your advantage.
Right.
So if you have if let's say that you're flipping coins and someone's paying you 110 every time it comes up heads, and you have to pay 100 every time it comes up tails, and it's a fair coin, your advantage is $10 for every 200 bet. You're about a 5% advantage. Well, you shouldn't bet more than 5% of your bankroll on that proposition. If you bet half of your bankroll on that proposition, each bet you make, you have the best of it, but your chance of going broke is basically 100%. So, but what's actually interesting about the Kelly criteria is that there are a lot of people that feel like you should bet half Kelly. And by betting half of your advantage, if you bet 2.5% of your bankroll on these bets where you have 5%, you're only costing yourself, so you're betting half as much, but you're only costing yourself 50% of that. You actually, because you don't go down as quickly, and there's just things about money management. So you can have the best of it, but if you overplay your bankroll, you will be broke over and over and over and over again in life.
So and the reason why is that there's variance, right? So anything that's not 100% can go wrong. And if you think about it, if you've got something that's going to lose 80% of the time, right? Well, the first time if you lose 80% of the time, and then if you flip it again, it's 80% of 80%. Well, that's not that surprising, right? Because that's 64%. And then it's 80% of 64% the next time. Again, not very surprising. And you can see this situation where it's really not that surprising. You could lose 5 or 6 of those in a row. It's just not that surprising. So you need to keep in mind that there's variance. Now, I do want to say that it breaks down, particularly at the low end. So if you've got $10 to your name and you're out on the street, and I walk up to you and I said, do you want to flip a coin, double or nothing? And I'm just giving you even money, right? So you don't even have an edge. You would be willing to do that. And the reason why is that the $10 that you have doesn't have a lot of value, number one, because if you go and buy a sandwich and a soda, it's gone. And so it's not a big deal for you to try to double that up, because that money, the extra money will have some utility for you. And the other thing is that the money is easily replaceable anyway, because you just hold up a sign saying, you know, need money, and you'll get $10 in an hour. But if you have $10 million, you wouldn't make the same bet, because you can't replace that money.
Does it differ in cash games versus in tournaments at all?
So, well, you just again take your edge. So in cash games, you're going to be tending to bet between 2.5% and 5% of your total bankroll in a session. And then you only want to bet in a no-limit game between 100 and 200 big blinds.
But you can't do that in tournaments.
But in tournaments, you want to bet between 1% and 2% of your bankroll, and that's going to depend on what the payout structure looks like. The flatter the payout structure, the higher the percentage of your bankroll you can put in play, because it's more likely you cash. Also, the lower variance the tournament itself is, which has things to do with like how fast the blinds are going up, how many people have entered the tournament, and things like that. So, for example, in the World Series of Poker, which is 8,000 people, and but they're paying 20% of the field, you could probably, where you're going to have generally a pretty big edge, you could risk 2%. But in a very tight tournament with good players, where the payout is only 10%. You might want to only risk 1%.
I would also argue, I would argue in the World
Last
Series of
point on
Poker
this.
main event that you can risk higher than 2%.
Right, well, because your edge is so
because it's a
great.
once in a, there's tremendous
true.
utility in playing in that event. You feel good and connected to the poker community just by
That
playing
is
in
true,
that
but
event.
just
There's
on a
lot
math
of-
decision,
it-
yeah, but-
Just on a math decision.
Let's take one more question, and then if you guys have time afterwards, if people want to come up to you, that'd be terrific. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Andrew. I'm a student here at UNLV. And this is for Ms. Duke and Mr. Lederer. I was wondering, you're telling everyone about your comfort zone and people being comfortable with their friends and then trying to go to bigger games because they think they're better than they are. How would someone know when it's that time to maybe go to a bigger
Well,
table?
actually, what you do is the way that you get better and you improve at poker is you find your comfort zone, you find a game that you can beat, you then beat that. I mean, if this is a game you can beat, you're going to beat that game. You then create kind of like a spare bankroll. And that's the bankroll. You're only willing to risk that extra money. You have enough money to play at the game you're comfortable with and that you know you can beat. You then build up a little bit of extra reserve, or maybe quite a bit of extra reserve, and you say, okay, now I'm going to go from 5-10 to 10-20. You will be uncomfortable. Okay? And you may even eventually start beating this game, but you may not even have an advantage right away. You are playing against better players that you're not used to playing against such quality players. Maybe the fish are about the same, but the winning, the professional players that are playing at that new level are much better. You're going to be out of your comfort zone, and there's a good chance you'll lose that little spare bankroll.
Mm-hmm.
You go back down. You're comfortable playing at this other stake game, and you probably play better because you were playing against better players now for a little while you maybe lost the spare bankroll. You build up your spare bankroll again, you move back up. Eventually, now that new game is your comfort zone game. And you start building your bankroll, and then it's just rinse and repeat. You just keep, I mean, literally, that's how every top player did it. They found their comfort zone, they pushed themselves a little bit, but hopefully with spare money. They went back down, they pushed themselves, they went back down, they pushed themselves, they finally stuck at the new level, and then they got comfortable there, then they looked for the next level and the next level.
So there's another way to think about it, which is also covered in my book. So let's say that you're talking about a no-limit game, and that depending on how loose or tight the game is, which just has to do with the variance in the game, you're willing to risk between 100 big blinds and 200 big blinds. So let's say your normal game is $1 to no limit, and so in that game you're willing to risk between $200 and $400, right? And so you know that that's your normal range of risk for that game, and you look over at the 2 and 4 game that day and you're like, wow, it looks like there's a lot of 1 and 2 fish cakes that are playing over in that 2 and 4 game. Geez, I really feel like trying that. Well, you know that for the 2 and 4 game, your minimum risk would be 400 and your maximum risk would be 800. So you say, well, 400 is an amount that I would actually naturally risk in my 1 and 2 game if the game's kind of wild and crazy. So that wouldn't be a bankroll breaker if I go take a minimum shot at the 2 and 4 game. And then if I lose, it's okay, because I can lose back down here, and that's an amount that I could actually reasonably expect to win at my normal game, so I haven't blown out my whole month. I'm not going to feel like I blew it, and I'm all emotional now for the rest of the month because I feel like I can never get my money back, because I actually only lost the same amount that I would have been willing to risk in my daily game anyway, right? So you go take a shot. If you lose the 400, you go back to your 1 and 2 game, and you play for a while until you see a good opportunity come up. If you win, then you can decide, well, maybe I'll try this again the next day, again taking these small shots until you feel comfortable with it. Or maybe you come in the next day and the 2 and 4 doesn't have those really bad players, so you still want to go back to 1 and 2. But you're kind of toggling between 1 and 2 and 2 and 4, where you're never risking more in the 2 and 4 game than you'd be willing to lose in the 1 and 2 game. The thing that you don't want to do is be sitting in your 1 and 2 game and look over at the 5 and 10 game and say, wow, that looks really good today. Because whatever amount you're going to risk in that 5 and 10 game would be an amount that you actually probably couldn't even expect to reasonably win in a full month of playing 1 and 2. And you never want to have an effect on your whole bankroll for like the whole month where you feel like you can't get it back unless you play higher.
And on that note, since I think they're getting ready to turn the lights out on us,
thank you.
I want to thank Howard, Annie, Jack, and Russell, and all of you for joining us this evening.